So I am a person with a disability. It is a visible disability. Some people have invisible disabilities. Of course, I'm follically challenged. All right, that's enough for the jokes. Growing up as an able-bodied youth, what did I know about persons with disabilities? I loved to watch the wheelchair basketball games. It was like NASCAR, running into each other, waiting for the crashes. There was the Man in Motion going around the world, raising money for spinal cord research. And all the villains in the James Bond movies were disfigured or disabled. What was up with that? Anyway, in the blink of an eye, when I was 24, I became what some of you here are, but don't want to disclose, what some of you may become, what some of your friends and family may have now or may become later. I'm a person with a disability. So after my accident, and it was clear that I was going to be in the wheelchair, I wanted to become independent as possible. So I was lucky. I had a university degree. I had a strong, resourceful support from the community. So I was able to get a job and get accessible housing. I got a sweet new chair and not such a sweet looking station wagon. And within a short amount of time, I was basically independent and I was living my new normal. But for many persons with a disability, both acquired later in life or born with one, they struggle to deal with living in a society that is either designed and built for able-bodied people. And for underrepresented groups and marginalized groups, having a disability, those barriers are much, much greater. So for clarification, when I say disability, I mean all disabilities. So that includes mobility disabilities from power chair users to persons with artificial limbs. There's hearing, visual, intellectual, and cognitive disabilities. So with my new normal, I was lucky enough that I had the luxury to be looking at what I would do in my free time with sport and recreation or hobbies. And growing up, I was pretty much a jock. In high school, I used to hang out at the jock stop. So I knew I was a jock. So it was only natural that I kind of gravitated towards sports. And that is when I found sailing. There was a group, Sail Able Association, and they took persons with disabilities out on the water. So I still remember that life-changing day when I left my wheelchair at the dock and I sailed out onto the ocean, and just that feeling of freedom that just went through all of my body. And it's hard to explain, but it just feels really good to be on the water, and it's like a mental massage. I enjoyed learning how to sail, how to race, the physics of sailing. I was able to bring my friends out on the water and have adventures, and I became hooked, and I was literally a crazy sailing fool. I joined the Canadian sailing team, and I got to sail around the world for 18 years, and I went to 5 Paralympic Games, and I even got a few medals. I was proud to be a Paralympian. I got to see firsthand how the Paralympics would transform that host city, the people's perceptions of what people with disabilities could achieve. There was something that they could relate to in seeing the athletes kind of go for gold, as they say. So that was really cool to be part of that transformational change. So now, after Rio 2016, I've retired, and I'm back in Nova Scotia, and I've got my dream job. I'm the Parasport Coordinator for Sport Nova Scotia. So now I'm able to be in a position where I had that feeling of freedom. I can help others have that feeling of freedom. And it also is my little small way to help build healthier and happier societies by creating active lifestyles. So after 2 years into the job, we've done some really awesome and amazing things. It was already going on before I got there, but I'm really happy to be part of this. So we have para water skiing, people are playing basketball, they have downhill skiing, we have recently wheelchair boxing is a thing, who knew? Para karate. So we also have youth camps for children with disabilities, and we get them to play different sports every week. So it's really exciting. But unfortunately, the stats tell a different story. Only 3% of people with disabilities in Canada are partaking in organized sport. So that is a really low number. And unfortunately, that means they're not maybe getting that feeling of being active, recreation, and sport. So why is that? Well, some people just might not like sports, and that's okay, I get it. Some people don't think that because they're disabled that they should play parasports, or that there's a stigma about saying that you are disabled and that you would play in a parasport. And for a large group of people, they are dealing with the greater barriers of dealing in a society that stigmatizes them, and there's barriers. So whether it's food security, getting a job, accessible housing, how could they think about playing parasport? So we want to change those things, but the odds are too much against them. So there's 1 billion people in the world that are disabled. The United Nations has called that the most discriminated minority group in the world. So those discriminations are in the form of barriers and stigma. So what if we were able to cherish and value each other's differences? What if our contribution to society wasn't limited by the barriers and stigmas? What if a person's impairment wasn't the disability, but rather society's ability to accommodate that impairment that was the real disability? So that's the big shift. What would that look like? If one person had a disability, we would all have a disability. We would have that empathy. So how would we have a strategy to kind of get through that? Well, lucky enough, we have provincial and federal legislation that is tackling that problem right now. We have the Provincial Accessibility Act, not even a year old, and we have the Accessible Canada Act that's being voted on in the next few months. So these two acts will give a strategy to help start changing the culture and minds around inclusion and access. There is already the Human Rights Code, there's building codes, there's employment equity policies, and those things have helped progress and reduce the barriers, and it's gone a long way to reducing it and making more opportunities. So we're just going to use these two acts to build upon that and help to identify, prevent, and eliminate barriers to society. So it's a big job. They want to be barrier-free here in Nova Scotia by 2030 based on 6 areas. So I'd like to just briefly go through the 6 and give you a little sneak peek into it. And before I do that, it's not law, and what I say here can't be taken literally, but I do have an inside scoop, and I'm pretty sure they'll be talking about these things. So Nova Scotia has gone and done a lot of consultation with Nova Scotians, and they've actually prioritized the importance of these 6. So I'm going to count down from 6 to 1 for drama's sake, and just go through them. So number 6 is goods and services. So goods and services will be educating around things like procurement of goods and services, the use of assistive devices and service dogs, and also how to deal with your customers that have disabilities. Now this is a big one that you can use in everyday life, and I'll give you a good hint right now, is when you see someone with a disability, you want to help, or maybe you want to start pushing them or do things for them, you should ask them, how can I help you? And that's the golden rule. Number 5, information and communication. How and where to use American Sign Language and Braille. And also the World Wide Web has accessibility standards for people with visual impairments, so that when they use screen readers to go on the websites, there's a format that they follow that everyone will be able to get the information. Number 4 is transportation. So we want to have available and accessible transportation throughout the province in both rural and urban areas when it comes to buses, taxis, and ferries. There's rail and plane, which would be under the jurisdiction of the Federal Accessible Canada Act. Number 3 is employment, which was close to number 2. And this is going to be involving things like employment equity policies. It's going to have to do a lot with accommodating your employees with a disability. Now, there's a lot of stigma about hiring people with disabilities. And it's a disturbing stat, but over 50% of Canadians think it's too risky to hire persons with disabilities, when actual research has shown that they're more reliable, take less sick days, and it's also ironic that we want to grow our workforce and grow as a country, and we have all this hidden workforce hiding in plain sight. Number 2 is education. So we want to eliminate barriers to students with disabilities from early childhood education up to post-secondary. And for me, this is arguably the most important because we're not born with stigma or discrimination. It's something that's learned. So when they're young, if we can teach them together, able-bodied and children with disabilities, to see value in each other, then we've made a real big change. And number 1, you probably knew it already, the built environment, the infrastructure. So this is buildings and public spaces, shared spaces. So it's going to be, that's going to mean the buildings, the beaches, trails, parks, etc. And what it's going to mean is it's more than just ramps. It's going to be, say, parking. It's going to be lighting. There's going to be washrooms. The fire alarms will blink. So it'll be sensory rooms. So it's for all disabilities. So before you get too scared that you're working in a 200-year-old building and it's impossible for it to become accessible, you get a pass because there's a thing called undue hardship. If you can prove that it's just impossible and you would go bankrupt to make it accessible, then you don't have to do that. But what we're talking about here is to build it right the first time. So, or if you're going to do a major renovation, that it comes up to a certain standard. So also, Rick Hansen Foundation has recognized that this is a need to educate our architects, developers, engineers, and they're developing courses that are going to be rolled out across Canada, and here at the NSCC, it's a new course. And it's just good business. It's, you get more money, more people through the door, you're going to have more money, and a whole lot more money. So right now, we have 14% of consumer spending is done by persons with disabilities, and that's $165 billion. By 2030, that number will jump up to 21%, and it will be $317 billion. As we get older, the likelihood of us getting a disability gets higher. So there's a good business case to become accessible. So that's the 6, not too complicated, right? So if I haven't convinced you already that it's a good thing to start thinking about this because A, it's a human rights issue, it's the right thing to do, it's also good business, and also there's a chance that you or a family member could become disabled, and it's kind of like investing in your future. Well, if all that still doesn't convince you, this act has teeth. So it resides here in Nova Scotia in the Justice Department. So if you don't comply and you're in violation, there are mechanisms for the public to report you, and then you will be given a warning, and then there will be fines. Because you can't always force everyone to care, but giving a hefty fine will get your attention. So legislation will only take you so far, and that will help to remove the barriers, but it's the stigmas that we all have to think about and change our minds about. We have to become accessibility mindful and grow the empathy and understand what it's like to be in other people's shoes. What is good for one is good for all. What is good for all is good for one. I look forward to meeting again here in 2030 to celebrate that we have removed all the barriers and stigmas, and we'll be seeing more people playing parasports, and Canada will be a little bit healthier, wealthier, and happier. And I'd like to leave you with one quote from Nelson Mandela: "It always seems impossible until it's done." Thank you very much.